Hello everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Board Basics, our webinar series covering the nuts and bolts of running your nonprofit board. Our topic today is understanding the role of board and advisory committees. My name is Jason Q. I'm a managing attorney with our nonprofit and small business legal assistance programs here at the DC Bar Pro Bono Center. A copy of these slides should be available on the webpage that hosts this webinar. You can find that webpage at www.lawhelp.org/dc/CED. So a little bit more about the Pro Bono Center before we start. We have a range of programs that assist nonprofits in the DC area and beyond. First and foremost, we match nonprofit organizations with pro bono legal counsel. So if your nonprofit has a large substantive legal matter that you'd like legal assistance on, we can help find you volunteer attorneys who can assist with many different types of legal issues, including corporate governance, IRS compliance, employment law, real estate, and much more. We also host in-person half-day legal clinics that address specific issues such as governance policies, reviewing your insurance policies, discussing your intellectual property needs. These occur throughout the year. We sponsor trainings, webinars, and podcasts on important real-world legal issues facing nonprofits, such as today's presentation. And we provide written resources and archive training sessions on our website. And again, that website link is there, lawhelp.org/dc/CED. So here's an outline of what we're going to cover in today's webinar. Again, our topic is committees of the board, including board committees and advisory committees. Today's webinar is meant to provide a very general overview of what board committees are. We're going to cover the basic rules for how they should function and provide some examples of specific committees and committee structures that are used by nonprofits. Right off the bat, I want to note that committees are an extremely fact-specific topic. Whether you need any committees at all or what specific committees you might want to have will vary according to the size, mission, culture, and structure of your organization and of your board. So we're going to be operating on a pretty high level today, but I think it's going to be a useful exercise to familiarize people with what committees are and what they do. There will also be a handful of references to DC law in this presentation. If your organization is not based in DC, then these rules might not apply to you. If you're a non-DC organization, I would approach these sections as more of an issue spotting exercise. Note what the rule in DC is, and then check to see what the corresponding rule is in your home jurisdiction. I will say that DC's nonprofit code is based off the model nonprofit code, meaning that our rules represent more or less the standard or common approach to these nonprofit legal issues. They're a really good starting place for understanding what the rules might be. So let's start with our first section, a little bit of background talking about the general duties of the board. As you probably already know, a director on a nonprofit board is a fiduciary with respect to that nonprofit organization. That means that directors have a legally recognized and enforceable obligations to the nonprofit. In DC, we recognize 4 specific duties: duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience, and a duty to inform. The one that we want to dig into a little bit more that's relevant to board committees is this duty of care. Under a duty of care, a director must act in good faith and as a reasonable, prudent person would act under similar circumstances. This includes being informed, using common sense, and being diligent when performing their director duties, attending, participating, and voting during board meetings and committee meetings, engaging in open debate and critically assessing the information that they receive as part of their board service, and finally reviewing the financial records of the organization. So an important component of that duty of care are attending board meetings. To exercise your duty of care, you must meet and vote to oversee the nonprofit's operations and to make critical decisions as a director of the organization. Generally speaking, a board may only act at a duly called board meeting where proper notice has been given and quorum is present. A board member can participate via electronic communications like video or conference call, providing that the director can hear the other directors speak and that there's some mechanism for voting. The director is then considered present at the meeting. But still, you have to either have an in-person meeting where people are in the room, or some people can be there electronically. The rule is still that the voting and the discussion must happen within the context of such a meeting. Minutes should be taken to capture that deliberation occurred and that votes were taken. We have a separate webinar on taking meeting minutes as part of our Board Basics series. You might want to check that out. We also do have a separate webinar about calling and holding board meetings and on board voting on our Law Help website as well. And the final point on this slide that we want to drive home is that in DC, a board member cannot vote by ballot and that you can't vote by proxy. So this is an issue that we still see coming up with nonprofit boards. What we need to understand is that in DC and many other jurisdictions, voting on a nonprofit board as opposed to a for-profit board or as voting as a member of a membership organization, it's an individual fiduciary responsibility of the individual director. So that means that you can't vote by ballot, where you don't go to the meeting and instead you vote online or through some other ballot mechanism, because you won't be there for the discussion and deliberation and debate that would happen in the context of a meeting. And we need to have that discussion and debate for directors to cast a fully informed vote that satisfies their duty of care. And for the same reason, you can't vote by proxy, where you send someone else to the meeting saying, I know we're going to vote on approving the budget. I looked at the budget. Can you vote yes on my behalf? You can't do that as well, and it's the same rationale. It's that you weren't there to participate in and to receive the information that comes out at a meeting, and therefore you can't cast a fully informed vote. So, you know, while we can attend meetings electronically, the obligation is still to attend the meeting, and there is a kind of time commitment that comes with board service in that sense. The only exception to this in-meeting rule is acting via unanimous written consent. This is something that's explicitly allowed in the DC Nonprofit Code and should be allowed at your nonprofit unless it's prohibited in the bylaws. This means that actions can be taken in writing, including via email, provided that the action being taken is clearly spelled out, and that all directors then serving on the board, so on an 11-person board, all 11 directors affirmatively agree in writing to the action. The kind of thinking here is that if you can get total unanimous agreement on an action, then we didn't need the debate and the deliberation and the information sharing that we would usually need at a meeting. A note for if you're doing these unanimous written consents via email, the director's written agreement must clearly identify the identity of the director. So make sure that you have a clear email address and a signature box that identifies who's sending that email. And the email needs to clearly identify the actual action being taken. So you might want to reattach the resolution or the action that you're agreeing to, or clearly reference in your email, including a full history chain of the conversation, so that we can figure out what action you're agreeing to. Okay, so let's zoom back out. Because of these workload requirements, the board can often use committees to help carry out its mission. So some benefits of board committees include, first and foremost, the workload division. A board can delegate some of its tasks to committees so that the full board can focus on core governance issues. Committees can spend more time delving into their specialized area, and then they can report back to the board and do a lot of the work in the committee. Another benefit of using committees is that you can leverage expertise. So committees allow tasks to be dealt with by directors with special interests or expertise. This is true especially of like the audit or finance committees, where you can use people with financial experience, or your public relations or communications committees for people with that kind of skill set. Another benefit is flexibility and timeliness. Committees, because they're smaller and more intimate, allow the organization to make decisions when the full board is not in session and/or where a quorum might be hard to reach. And this can be especially helpful for larger boards or boards with long distance members across different time zones, where coming together and having a quorum satisfying full meeting might be difficult. And finally, board committees are a great opportunity for enhanced director engagement. Committees can create opportunities for leadership development and deeper board engagement, especially on the large boards, especially for maybe new members to the board. They can find committees to be, again, a smaller, more intimate place to really contribute and to leverage their expertise. Okay, so let's lay out some ground rules for board committees. The first rule, the most important rule, is that you can only have directors on your board committees. So that means that if the committee has the power to take final board action, then only directors can sit on that committee. This is something that was clarified in the 2010 revision of the DC Nonprofit Code. It's the rule in most states, but we still find some nonprofits having a little bit of confusion, thinking that they can use board committees that vote and make board level decisions as a way of involving non-board members. That might include top staff, like your CEO, if they're not simultaneously director. But the rule is, if it's a board committee, you can only have directors on that committee. Now, you can, of course, have committees with non-board members, but those must be structured and those must function in a purely advisory capacity. And we'll talk more about advisory boards later. A second rule is that the creation of new board committees and appointment of members to those committees should be approved by all the directors currently in office, not just a majority of directors at a particular meeting. The rationale here is that because you're delegating the board's authority to a subset of the board, that act of delegation, that decision to delegate, must be approved by the full board. So, you don't want to have a 9-person board where you have 5 people at a meeting, and those 5 people, 3 of them vote to create a new executive committee and to put themselves on that executive committee. A committee like that can be very powerful. It can make board level decisions. You don't just want 3 out of 9 people able to approve the creation of that kind of committee. So the creation of board committees and the appointment of individuals to those committees must be done by the full board. A majority of the full board, I should say. And then a last tip before I move to the next slide is that we should generally keep the same procedural formalities and rules on our committees as we do on the full board. And so that means no remote ballot or proxy voting, keeping contemporaneous meeting minutes, and per IRS regulations, that means either the earlier of 60 days or the next meeting. And this is something that the 990 does ask you about. It asks you if your committees keep contemporaneous minutes. The committee chair should prepare and circulate agendas before each meeting. You should run the meetings efficiently, stick to the agenda. This is all to respect the committee members' time. And you should keep track of attendance and address absentee or non-contributing committee members, just as you would track the attendance and participation of members of the full board. A thing to keep in mind is that delegating to board committees doesn't absolve the other directors of their fiduciary duties, including their duty of care. So directors can generally rely on board committees to act efficiently and to make good decisions, but they must still ask questions, seek out clarifying information, read the reports coming out of the committee, think critically about the committee's work, and evaluate the committee's performance. You can't rely on committees if there are red flags regarding their performance. So if you know that your finance committee isn't meeting monthly, isn't meeting on a regular basis, or if you know or have some signal that they're not doing a deep dive into the organization's finances, you can't turn a blind eye to that and just rely on the work that that committee does. The full board should step in and take over those functions. You should always designate an individual. It's usually the committee chair to report on the committee's work back to the full board. Make sure that that responsibility is clearly given to an individual. To prevent burnout and to distribute work fairly, directors should not serve on multiple committees. That's just a best practice that we recommend. And finally, you should onboard and orient your new committee members and provide ongoing education and resources to support committee service. So serving on a board committee can be as much of a time commitment and a commitment of thought and resources as serving on the full board. We want to make sure that our board members are supported in that capacity. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how you might want to structure your board committees. The ideal number of committees, if any, will vary significantly by organization. We mentioned this up top. Factors include the overall workload, the ability to delegate work to staff, depending on whether you have staff, versus having an all-volunteer organization with more of a working board, and also the specialized needs of the organization. The big thing we want to emphasize is that we create board committees to increase efficiency and to leverage the different skills that we have in the organization. Having too many committees can actually reduce efficiency and create additional workload burdens. So for example, the additional time commitment of the individual members who sit on the committees, the new reporting and oversight burdens that come out of the committees and that fall onto the full board as well. If we have overlapping or poorly coordinated scopes of work, we can end up reproducing work or creating conflicting work or conflicting recommendations. And finally, there might not just be enough work to justify having a standalone committee, considering all the procedural formalities that we need to maintain to have that committee operate and to supervise the work of that committee. So as an alternative to creating new standing board committees, we can consider creating more time-limited ad hoc committees that exist just to perform a specific function, or we can create bundled or multi-purpose committees. We'll talk about that later. You can create a more informal board task force. That is, again, a smaller group of people who are tasked with a specific task, or we can just engage the full board in a more concentrated and kind of focused way to address a certain challenge or to perform a certain function instead of creating a new standing committee. Your governing documents can, but do not have to, require the creation of specific committees. So we see articles, or more commonly bylaws, that spell out that, that there will always be an executive committee or there will be a standing finance committee. That's okay, but a more flexible approach, and the approach that we recommend in our template bylaws, is to empower the board to create both standing and ad hoc committees as needed, and then to describe the duties and scope of work of those committees in separate board charters. That just gives you a lot more flexibility in your ability to create and also wind down boards according to really what the real world needs of the organization are as it kind of grows and changes over time. You should definitely adopt governance policies, especially a conflict of interest policy that applies to the full board, but that also applies to the work of your committees. For template bylaws with kind of template committee section, committee language, we have a link here. You can pull up that link on a PDF version of these slides, which will be available on the website. So let's run through some standing board committees that we find are commonly used with nonprofits, and 4 of these we'll do a deep dive in. The first 4 we'll do a kind of deeper dive in later in the presentation. So the first one we want to talk about is the executive committee. This is a committee that acts on behalf of the full board in between board meetings. So it's a subset of the full board that acts on behalf of the full board and can generally make any decision that the full board can make. It's great for making routine or administrative decisions, can also handle more confidential matters like CEO evaluation and compensation. Another common standing board committee is a finance committee. This oversees the financial affairs of the organization. It typically meets monthly to review your financial records and to engage in more long-term financial analysis and planning. It may approve modifications to the organization's budget, its financial policies, etc. Many organizations also have a standing audit committee. So this oversees the financial audit function of the organization. If your organization is larger and undergoes an annual financial audit, your audit committee will oversee that process. That includes also, though, the risk management functions of the organization. So doing a risk analysis, finding strategies from risk mitigation, purchasing and maintaining insurance can also be another function of the audit committee. And the audit committee can also oversee conflicts of interest or potential conflicts of interest within the board and between the organization. It can also engage in internal investigations. Another common standing committee is your governance or board service committee. This committee recruits and evaluates board members. It can be responsible for nominating a slate of incoming directors and officers. It can also review and recommend internal governance policies or procedural changes. Many organizations also have a compensation committee. So handling CEO evaluation and compensation is a unique duty of the board. The CEO doesn't have a boss above them aside from the board of directors. So it's up to the board to set CEO compensation. The IRS has specific rules and a specific safe harbor that organizations can use when setting compensation. So the compensation committee might exist to kind of follow that process. The committee can also set compensation policies for other individuals in the organization, for maybe your upper level executives, or compensation policies more generally. Many organizations also have a development or fundraising committee. This committee can be responsible for overseeing the fundraising work of the organization. It can develop fundraising goals, fundraising plans. It can oversee fundraising efforts. For those organizations that are funded heavily by grants or other kind of single source funding streams, the committee can be responsible for identifying potential grants, overseeing the application process, and ensuring grant compliance. This can be a standing committee of the board, but as we'll talk about later, this is also commonly an advisory committee where you can involve non-board members. And then some maybe less common board committees, but that might be a good fit for your organization depending on more specialized needs. A lot of organizations benefit from having a communications or public relations committee. This oversees the creation of campaigns, advertisements, print materials, social media content, and other materials that raise awareness of the nonprofit's work and that can aid with development efforts, especially organizations that do a lot of advocacy work. Having a communications or public relations committee can help actually push forward the mission of the organization itself. Again, this could be a board committee, but it can also be an advisory committee that uses the skills of non-board members. You might want to consider having an impact and evaluation committee for those organizations with substantive programs and services. This committee can develop and implement systems to measure and assess the nonprofit's impact and outcomes. So they might identify and determine the outcomes that we're looking to meet. It can identify the metrics that we're going to use and the assessment methods that we're going to use to evaluate the organization's performance and impact. Another committee that some nonprofits have is a program committee. So again, for those with substantive programs and services, this committee can oversee the long-term or strategic planning of the programming you're going to offer. It can also manage program evaluation, perform needs assessment to see where new programs might be needed, and again, assist in program development. For membership organizations, so for organizations that might have dues-paying members that in return get certain services and there's a relationship between the nonprofit and its members, it might make sense to have a membership committee that focuses on member recruitment, member engagement, collecting feedback, tailoring the membership benefits that you offer, setting membership fees, etc. Some nonprofits are also formally membership organizations, meaning that the members also participate in the legal governance of the organization. Critically, the members might nominate and elect the board of directors. For an organization like that, there are additional administrative burdens that come with maintaining that kind of membership organization. So I'm talking about both kinds of organizations here. More commonly, we have the first kind where you have a pool of members that engage with the organization and that might receive certain benefits, but might not necessarily participate in the governance of the organization. You can also have a personnel or human resources committee, a committee that develops and monitors HR policies and procedures across the organization. For smaller organizations that might just have a couple of staff, this committee could be more of a working committee that actually handles some of the more mundane HR matters and requirements for that organization. For those organizations with maybe a large endowment or other assets, or just a lot of investments, it might make sense to have an investment committee that develops and implements and oversees your investment policies and that oversees the investment portfolio of the nonprofit. So those are standing committees. Those are committees that are going to be there long term. People can sit on them for a number of years, get a lot of expertise. They perform ongoing functions that are important to the nonprofit. But we can also have ad hoc committees. So these are more time-limited committees that are created to carry out a specific function or to perform a specific task. And I have a list of kind of some common ad hoc committees here. So you'll see committees that exist just to plan special events. It could be your annual campaign, your annual fundraiser, annual gala, or maybe just a one-off event. These can be committees that oversee a capital campaign. If you have a top executive transitioning out of the organization, you might want to create a committee just to help with succession planning and a search for the new replacement executive. If you're changing locations, if you're building a new building, if you're looking for a new building, that can be the job of an ad hoc committee. If you're engaging in cyclical strategic planning, so maybe you create a 10-year plan, that can be the job of an ad hoc committee to oversee that strategic planning process. Although I will mention that a lot of boards build strategic planning more as an ongoing obligation of the full board, and might not pull it out into a committee function. For those organizations that are just focused on their annual financial audit, instead of having, and they might not have a standing audit committee, you can have an ad hoc audit committee that just again performs those financial audit functions, so selecting the auditor, overseeing the audit, etc. If you periodically want to review your bylaws or your governance policies, you can have a kind of governance policy committee that performs that function. If you're contemplating potential partnerships or even a merger, that could be the job of an ad hoc committee. And again, other task forces as may be needed that respond to unique needs or challenges or opportunities for the organization. So, if you're a membership organization and you have declining membership numbers, you might want to create a committee to kind of analyze and address that issue and to come up with some recommendations. One kind of interesting and maybe newer committee structure that we hear about are these bundled committees. So as an alternative to creating standalone kind of single function committees, some nonprofits bundle multiple functions into one committee. So you might hear about a 4-committee model that has an internal affairs committee that handles finance and HRs and facilities and other kind of internal functions, and then an external affairs committee that handles fundraising and PR, communications, maybe interfacing with members. That could be a separate committee. And then we have a governance committee that's focused on the board about recruiting and developing and evaluating the board, and then an executive committee to perform that kind of between meeting function that executive committees perform. So that's another way to do it. It could be more efficient for some organizations, assuming that you kind of have the personnel to fill out those committees and to have the expertise that you need in these kind of more broad multi-purpose committees. There are some legal limitations on what board committees can perform. So under DC law, a board committee can be authorized to take any steps that the board of directors can take, except that committees cannot authorize the distribution of the organization's assets. They can't adopt, amend, or repeal the bylaws. They can't fill vacancies on the board or any board committees. Again, you need the full board to nominate folks to the committees. And finally, in the case of membership organizations, and here we're talking about those formal legal membership organizations that have governance power, a committee can't propose any action to the members that require their approval. In DC, you can't have board committees that consist of one director, so you could have little mini committees if you like. Okay, so let's focus on 4 standing board committees that we want to delve a little bit more in depth into. The first one is the executive committee. So as we've talked about, this is a subset of the full board that has the authority to make decisions, any decision that the full board could otherwise make. You can narrow that. So the bylaws or the executive committee charter can carve out other exceptions. For example, you might not want this committee to be able to hire or fire the CEO, even though that's something that the full board could do. The board can also limit the committee's authority to overturn a previous board decision unless the facts materially change. That might probably a good idea to kind of create a more stable situation and create more predictability. Your bylaws can also require the board to ratify certain decisions that are made by the executive committee, so that there's kind of a formal requirement that the board exercise some oversight. But in any case, the executive committee should always report back to the full board and should always be overseen by the full board, so that the full board is exercising its fiduciary duties. Executive committees, why do you want to have them? Well, they traditionally serve 4 main purposes. First, your full board might not meet too often, and convening special meetings of the board might be logistically difficult. So in these situations, the executive committee can handle the more routine or administrative matters and sort of free the full board from having to A, address those matters at their full board meetings, or B, having to convene special meetings of the board in order to address those kind of more routine or admin matters, the timing of which might not match up with your board meeting calendar. The executive committee can make decisions more quickly and more nimbly, especially in times of crisis. So because it's a smaller, more intimate committee, if something that's very time sensitive comes up, the committee can spring into action, have a meeting very quickly, and act more quickly. The membership of the executive committee is typically consists of people in leadership positions within an organization. That means they're more informed and they might be able to make decisions more easily or efficiently. That's another kind of benefit. And finally, the executive committee can serve as a sounding board for senior management in a way that a larger group of directors cannot. So again, because it's a smaller, more intimate group of directors who are typically in leadership positions within the organization, this might be a better forum for interfacing with your CEO or other top executives and just being a really candid and open place for the CEO to discuss kind of what's keeping them up at night or what concerns they have about the organization. They might be more inclined to do that with a smaller executive committee than bringing all of those concerns to the full board. Now, those are some benefits. There are some concerns that are raised by executive committees. The first is that the executive committee might become cliquish and exclude other directors from decision making. Relatedly, the full board might then become disengaged and take a back seat to the executive committee, resulting in a board and in individual directors that fail to meet their fiduciary duties. Also, by establishing an executive committee, the board might really be failing to address more systemic problems like board attendance. So if the reason you made an executive committee is that you can't get the full board to come together and have a meeting where that meets the quorum, that's a attendance and engagement issue that you're just really band-aiding over by moving all the decisions to an executive committee. And that maybe a better governed organization will be one that kind of address those attendance and engagement issues more head-on. So generally, opinions are mixed about whether executive committees actually improve governance. You should decide for yourself whether it's a good fit for your organization. And again, we do have a separate webinar on executive committees that delves into them a little bit more deeply, and the link to that is there. So the second standing board committee that we want to spend a little bit more time talking about is the Finance Committee. This is one of the major workhorse committees of the board. It should meet at least monthly. It's comprised of independent directors. This means these directors have no family or business relationships with the nonprofit itself or with other directors on the board. And you want to have as much financial expertise as possible on the board. That focus on having independent directors on the Finance Committee is there to prevent the committee from having too many conflicts of interest, which could hold up the committee's work and the committee's decision making. The full board, again, is still ultimately responsible for overseeing and improving the major items or decisions that come out of the Finance Committee, so including your annual budget. That's something you want your full board to have some say in and to have final sign-off on. We have a really great guidebook called The Role of the Board of Directors in Financial Oversight on our website. This covers kind of the main oversight functions that the board has with regards to financial matters and financial controls, and that can apply to the full board, but it can also apply to your Finance Committee if that's what you've decided to structure it as. So let's review some of these key functions of the Finance Committee. First and foremost, it is assessing the financial health and sustainability of the organization on a regular basis. So the committee should review financial statements and understand at a more granular level the organization's cash flow and how budget is measuring up against actual expenses in real time. Committee should do a deep dive into the finances, ask, are expenses in line with the budget? Are there financial shortcomings that we need to address and adjust for? The committee should also assess longer-term financial sustainability. Is the organization meeting its long-term fundraising goals? Has it missed a key grant or an expected donation? The Finance Committee is the early warning system to identify and to address these issues so that the organization can adjust its budget and its spending accordingly. If you don't have an independent fundraising or development staff or a fundraising committee, the Finance Committee can also be responsible for developing and implementing your fundraising strategy. Another key function of the Finance Committee is budgeting. The committee can work with staff to develop the budget for the coming fiscal year. It should ensure that financial projections for income and expenses are reasonable and based on past performance, and that they're consistent with the organization's mission and strategic plan. Another key function is creating financial policies and implementing financial controls. So the Finance Committee should develop and implement financial controls, processes, and policies for the organization. These will enhance transparency and reporting, and they also protect organizations against theft or fraud. Nonprofits are unfortunately very often the target of theft or financial fraud, so we need controls there to kind of help us protect against wrongdoing or financial mismanagement. The Finance Committee, absent a standalone investment committee, can also oversee the organization's investments and financial reserves, including retirement plans and how those plans are performing. If you don't have a standalone audit committee, the Finance Committee can be responsible for overseeing the audit and for the associated risk management functions. And speaking of risk management, if that's not something that your audit committee or other individuals in the organization is in charge of, you can give that responsibility to the Finance Committee to assess and mitigate and ensure against organizational risk. Okay, but let's turn to the Audit Committee. So this is the third one we're going to spend a bit more time on. A standing Audit Committee is responsible for ensuring that the organization complies with legal requirements, internal policies, and best practices. It reviews and prepares the organization's Form 990 financial disclosure that's sent to the IRS, along with other state-level filings that might be required. It importantly oversees the external auditor's independent audit of the financial affairs of the organization if your organization does go under audit. This means selecting the auditor or recommending the auditor for the full board to select. It means overseeing the audit process. This third point is important. It should meet privately with the auditor to discuss the audit results. So the auditor's results might come up with shortcomings or vulnerabilities vis-a-vis management or how certain ways that the organization's run. It's nice to have a smaller, more intimate audit committee that the auditor can meet with and to candidly discuss those findings. That definitely doesn't have the managers in that room in the meeting, and is also not the full board. So again, we can have a more candid and intimate discussion. The audit committee can resolve disputes between the auditor and management, and it can present the audit results to the full board. Again, we keep talking about risk management. That can be a function of the audit committee. It can oversee the risk management function by performing a systemic risk analysis of the organization's activities and ensuring that plans are in place to mitigate risks to the best ability that you can, and then to ensure against losses at the back end should they occur. The audit committee should remember that not all losses are insurable, so that's why risk mitigation and having a nimble, flexible organization can be important. And that not all losses are financial, that there can be reputational risks that might affect your programs, your ability to get volunteers and funding. This should kind of be within the scope of what the audit committee is thinking about when it performs this risk management function. And finally, the audit committee can investigate internal complaints about, harassment or whistleblower complaints. You might have separate anti-harassment and whistleblower policies that strengthen that process. It can also investigate potential financial wrongdoing, such as mishandling of funds or theft of funds. Some best practices for the audit committee. The committee should be comprised entirely of independent directors, again, and if you have a separate finance committee, try to have no overlap between the audit committee and the finance committee, so that should the audit committee be investigating or auditing something that the finance committee did, that there's no conflicts of interest. That's the big idea there. At least one member of the audit committee should have an understanding of accounting principles and financial statements, experience preparing, auditing, analyzing, and evaluating financial statements, an understanding of internal controls and procedures for financial reporting, and an understanding of other audit committee functions, including that risk management function. Okay, and the final committee that we'll talk about here is the governance committee. So a governance committee, sometimes called a board service or board affairs committee, oversees the recruitment, training, and evaluation of board members. It can perform an annual evaluation of the board to determine the skills needed when recruiting new board members, and then subsequently can actually be the body that nominates or proposes a slate of potential new candidates for the board. It can also propose a slate of candidates for open board officer positions. The governance committee can oversee the process of conducting board orientation for new board members and for identifying and developing continuing education opportunities. And it's to definitely conduct a board and committee self-evaluation. For the full board, that's an evaluation of how the board's performing and what can be improved. For the same thing for the committees, but also when you're doing a committee self-evaluation, thinking about how the committees are structured and whether committees still need to exist, or if they can be wound down or combined with other committees or with the full board. The governance committee can review and update as necessary governing documents or governance policies for organization. As we mentioned, that could be the job of an ad hoc committee, or you can give that job to your governance committee. The governance committee can also be responsible for assessing and monitoring potential conflicts of interest between the nonprofit and its board members, pursuant to its conflict of interest policy. If you don't have a conflict of interest policy, governance committee should be the body that develops one. So those are our board committees. Again, these are committees comprised only of board members who can make board level decisions, sometimes binding decisions on behalf of the organization. Now we're going to shift to advisory committees. Advisory committees or advisory councils cannot make binding decisions on behalf of the organization. Their charters provide that they can only make recommendations to the full board for its adoption. Advisory committees can also be given the same authority to act or implement decisions of the board, similar to how senior staff could be given that responsibility. So for example, once an event budget is approved by the board, the committee can then use those approved funds to hire a caterer, hire the band, etc. for maybe your annual gala or something like that. That's also a function that you can give to the advisory committee, because those aren't board level functions that cannot be performed by other parties. As a result, an advisory committee can include non-board members, and also membership on the advisory committee doesn't have to be approved by a majority of the full board. It is always a good idea, however, to assign a staff member or director to sit on your advisory committees, at least one, so that they can liaise with and report to the full board. Some good candidates for advisory committees include your development and fundraising committee. We mentioned this earlier. Having non-board members on your development and fundraising team can be very smart. It can be a way to engage donors or people with good fundraising contacts or fundraising skills, even if they're not members of the board. A communications or public relations committee can be a great advisory committee, because again, you can engage people with specialized skills who just want to get involved in the organization but might not want to be on the full board. A special event or campaign planning committee can be something that you could do through an advisory committee. Having your programs committee be an advisory committee can be really useful. If your nonprofit has substantive programs, an advisory program committee can be a great way to involve both subject matter experts and your clients or constituents who use your programming. So, for example, if you run an after-school program, maybe you want a parents committee that provides input on how your programs run and what they consist of. So program committees are a great way to involve kind of a wider constituency in the development of your programs. Along a similar line, if we're talking about community engagement and community involvement, some organizations create special advisory committees to engage a certain client subpopulation or a segment of the community. For folks who want to work with or focus on a subset of the community or their client base, this can be a really great way of kind of doing that focused engagement. It can be a way of empowering clients. It can be a good way of increasing the participation of certain minority groups in your organization. It can be a way of increasing the representation and participation of women or other potentially underrepresented groups. My one caveat here is that you can't achieve true diversity and inclusion by just creating a separate committee to engage people with specific experiences or perspectives. You still need to recruit and retain folks with those perspectives on your full governing board. But nevertheless, a committee can be a great way of supplementing or intensifying those efforts to be more diverse and inclusive in your leadership structure. And finally, something that's becoming a little bit more common or more popular are junior boards, or known as young leaders or young professional committees. These are committees that are designed specifically for recruiting and engaging younger donors or volunteers or potential future leaders in the organization. And then you can give the junior board certain responsibilities, like they might be responsible for holding some fundraisers or for developing recommendations about programs. The junior board can serve a lot of functions, but its structure and its purpose is to engage younger people in the work of the organization and to create a pipeline for potential future leaders. So some other just sort of practical tips about your advisory committees. Again, they can be standing advisory committees or they can be ad hoc. You should ensure that there's ongoing oversight and evaluation by the full board or a relevant board committee over your advisory committees. Again, maintain those basic board formalities, like making sure that you educate and onboard your new members, that there are meeting agendas and materials, that the meetings are being run effectively. We still want to respect the time and energy that our committee members are giving us. And it's also important to maintain two-way communication between your advisory committees and your governing boards. So report back to the advisory committee after you receive a recommendation about how the recommendation was assessed and if it was implemented. There should always be a back and forth. Again, this is just to make sure that the work being done by advisory committees is valued, that it's actually being implemented, and people feel like their time is being used effectively. Some kind of high-level benefits of having advisory committees. The first one is that, again, it allows another venue to kind of leverage and utilize specialized skills. You can recruit and engage people with fundraising or communication expertise without the burden or commitment of full board membership, or you might not have capacity on your board for new people. It's also a great way of engaging donors and other high-profile individuals. So you can involve and engage important donors, subject matter experts, leaders in the community, former leaders of your board, and other high-profile or prestigious individuals without requiring them to commit to full board membership, or again, you might not have the capacity to engage them as full board members, but you still want them involved in the organization. Some people talk about kind of letterhead advisory committees where you collect all of your influential thought leaders and other prestigious individuals. It can really elevate raise the profile of your organization or elevate the profile of your organization, and that might be something that organizations are interested in. Advisory committees are a great way of engaging community members and constituents. We've touched on this, that these committees can be a way for you to engage a wider constituent base, get more voices involved in the planning and decision-making process, kind of increase your influence and your profile across the community. And finally, advisory committees can be a great leadership development or pipeline development tool. They can be a forum for recruiting and test driving potential future directors or other leaders in the organization. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, you can direct them to me via email. My email is there. Again, our nonprofit resource library is lawhealth.org/DC/CED, and we do have a subsite or a subpage on that website all about board service, including all of the manuals and legal alerts that I've mentioned, and the other board basic webinars are hosted there as well. So you can check out that website there. Thank you for attending. Thank you for your time, and I'll talk to you at our next webinar. Bye.